Overnight learning center.
I saw that just yesterday.
All right, it is 6 o'clock, straight up, so I think I'll get us started. I really appreciate everyone coming out tonight. I know it's really cold, so thank you for braving the weather. And also for bearing with us. We had Adam scheduled originally in December. Fell on a pretty busy day in Moscow. I think all days are busy in Moscow, but we decided to reschedule, and I'm happy we did because this is a great crowd for a Thursday night. So thank you for coming out. We are going to hear Idaho's Water at Work and for Play, and this is a great tie-in to the Smithsonian exhibit that's here. If you haven't had a chance to check out Waterways, I really encourage you to take some time, maybe a few minutes after Adam's presentation, or come back when you have an hour. There really is so much content that you could spend a really great hour here learning about the relationship between people and water. The first and second floor have Smithsonian content, which will be here until January 21st. The 3 Saturdays in January, it will be open. Jessica is graciously opening up City Hall Saturdays from 10 to 2, so if you don't have a chance during the week to check it out, you can come in on Saturday. And there on the 3rd floor is a little bit of content about local water history, which the Latah County Historical Society curated. And if you don't know me, my name's Dulcie, and I am the director of the Latah County Historical Society, and we were lucky enough to partner with the city to bring this content here. So thank you again for coming, and I'm really excited to welcome Adam Sowards. Dr. Sowards is a lifelong Northwesterner, and he's an environmental historian, writer, and professor at the University of Idaho, where he also directs the program in Pacific Northwest Studies. Taking the American West as his main focus, he seeks to discover how people have understood their place in nature through time and then communicate that history. Currently, he is writing about various battles over public lands, including a book tentatively titled This Land is Our Land, and a project that investigates a campaign to stop an open-pit mine proposed for a wilderness area in Washington's Cascade Range. To date, he has published 3 books: Idaho's Place, A New History of the Gem State, and as a non-Idaho native, I highly recommend that for anybody who's trying to learn Idaho history. I thought it was a great crash course. There's lots of short essays about all different facets of Idaho's history, so really pick up a copy of that. The Environmental Justice, William O. Douglas, and American Conservation, and United States West Coast in Environmental History, as well as many scholarly articles and essays. I'll also put in a plug for another organization I'm involved with. The League of Women Voters of Moscow is inviting Dr. Sowards to speak to us later this spring about the public lands issue. So if that's something that you're interested in, keep an eye on the programs that the League of Women Voters offers. So with that, I'll let Dr. Sowards take it away.
This room is really nice if you want to talk to these folks, but the lectern kind of doesn't work. Hopefully I'll be able to drop these at some point in my conversation. Thanks, Dulcie, for having me, and the City of Moscow, and the Idaho Humanities Council, which is behind all of this as well. And thank you for coming on a very cold evening to be here with me. I'm glad to be up because sitting next to that window, it was quite chilly. It's good to be here. As Dulcie said, I'm a professor of environmental history, and I guess of Idaho, too. I've been writing about Idaho since I moved here. Water is kind of tangential to the work that I do, but water moves, right? And so I do other stuff, and water's there, and I do other stuff, and water's there. So I keep coming back to it. But first and foremost, rather than a natural resource guy or a water guy, I'm a historian. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind because I won't be able to answer your hydrological questions. I won't even attempt to answer your legal questions. But I hope to tell some stories and give some background and some explanations for some small parts of Idaho's history as it relates to water. I want to acknowledge that I'm sure that there are many people in this room, perhaps everyone in this room, who knows more than I do about some aspect of water in Idaho. And that's great. I hope you learn at least one thing from me. But at the end of it, if you want to tell me I was wrong or say, what about this? I certainly welcome that. This is not by any stretch going to be a comprehensive treatment of anything. Okay, So the Idaho Humanities Council contacted me and said, we're doing this great exhibit with Smithsonian called Waterways, and we'd like to know if you want to talk about Idaho water. And I said, of course, because I think as a historian it's important when we have these opportunities to talk to people about the past, we should say yes. Then I had to figure out what to say. Like, well, I don't know. How might I do this? And so I was thinking, and I thought some more. I thought a little longer. I thought, well, there are a couple of different ways we could approach this. And I thought about, well, you know, we know nature in various ways. We interact with nature in various ways. And we interact with it partly, and Idahoans have interacted with water partly through how we work. How water works for us. How water works by itself, pushing through rocks and things like that. But also, Idahoans have long figured out ways to play with water as well. To fish in it, to float on it, to be refreshed by it, to be inspired by it. So I thought, well, I'll try that. Maybe we can learn something if we look at how Idahoans have known water through work and play. I'm going to try to speak metaphorically for a moment, not my strong suit. As I prepared for this, I started to think of myself as a bird of prey. Stay with me here. Imagine for a moment a bird of prey floating high above the Idaho landscape. Bird of prey can see for a very long way. And for some time tonight, that's the level I will speak at. Big, broad, you can barely tell there are mountains here. Just huge overview. But every once in a while, that bird of prey will dive down and try to get something to eat. And I'll do that sometimes too. I'll dive down and grab a little nugget of information with a couple of details, and then I'll drop it, because sometimes that happens to a bird of prey too. And then there are other times I'm going to go in and I'm going to get that snake or whatever, and I'm going to hold on to it, and I'm going to talk about it for a while. So I'm going to zoom in and out. Some details you're going to go, oh, I wish we had more about that. Sorry. Some you're going to probably say, okay, I got it, you can move on. So that's sort of without further ado, I guess I'll move on from that. I'm going to start with mining. And most of the stuff I'm talking about is really rivers rather than water more generally. Not entirely, though. Hydraulic mining is a technology that was imported to Idaho from California. It was developed there first during the Great California Gold Rush, of course. And basically all it is, as you can see, I think, is this? Yeah, as you can see here, it's just a giant garden hose, highly pressurized, aimed at a hillside, and it washes away mountains with an incredible efficiency. It's not something that can be done simply, so it requires money. So this is not the sort of mining done with the guy with the big beard and his mule and his pickaxe. This is something done by corporations. Difficult thing to do. Idaho's hydraulic mining began in the 1860s. The first gold strike really in Idaho is 1860 in the Clearwater country. It quickly spreads all throughout Idaho, lots in different places. And hydraulic mining comes and it causes, well, it's super efficient at taking out the dirt and the minerals that are in the dirt, and it's also super efficient then at watching all sorts of sediment into streams, not particularly great for the fish who want to live there. Huge polluting factor. So this is one of the first technologies that works its way into Idaho and their history with water. And the marks last. Any of you who have driven between here and Riggins will probably recognize this. There's a big roadside sign that says hydraulic mining, and you can't tell because this is a big room, but there's this gouge right here in this part of this hillside that was created by what these people are doing right there. You can still see it today, well over a century after it happened. I want to move on to the Coeur d'Alene mining district. They called it the Coeur d'Alenes back then, the mining district. Now we call it the Silver Valley. Big strike happened, I think it's 1884 when the first one happened. And for about a century thereafter, it was the richest silver mine in history. We dug millions and millions and millions of tons of ore. This is a difficult process, and it creates a lot of waste. And the first thing that hard rock mining companies did was dump it, as you can see here. It goes right into the Coeur d'Alene River system. Really disastrous sort of pollution problems. As early as 1899, farmers downstream from this are saying, this is affecting our crops. This is killing our livestock. We'd really, like you to compensate us for that and stop these practices. 1899, sorry, I keep getting that date wrong. So really early, long time ago. The farmers are sort of persistent. They're loud. They know people in the legislature. And eventually the state commissions a group of scientists to study this, and they discover, you're right, this is bad stuff. From a study that came out in 1932, the State Commission concluded that in the Coeur d'Alene River, it was practically devoid of fish fauna, bottom fauna, or plankton organisms. So it's dead. The river is dead from the pollutants that are being dumped in. Again, this is really a wonderful picture of this big flume just pushing all sorts of mine waste and water into the river. The conclusion of this Fisheries Commission was we really should stop dumping this stuff directly into the river. This is the 1930s, I remind you. By the 1940s, the mining company is still arguing to the public, it's in the public interest that we do this. So it continues. By the 60s, about 14,000 residents who are living in the Coeur d'Alenes are dumping their raw sewage into the river system. About 2,200 tons of mine slimes are going into the river system every day. And it goes down the river, obviously, and ends up in Lake Coeur d'Alene, ultimately, if it doesn't go into a side stream on its way. Really nasty system, of course. Meanwhile, nationally, people are getting concerned about such things. By the early 1970s, we have something called the Clean Water Act. It's designed to help improve things like this. By 1980, we have something, I can never remember all this, I have to read it. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. We call it either CERCLA or Superfund. This gets passed, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, lists the Coeur d'Alene Mining District in 1983 on its national priorities list. I've heard it said that it's the largest Superfund site in America. I've heard that said about pretty much every Superfund site I've ever heard about, so I'm not sure which one is the biggest. It's pretty good size, and the EPA was up there for a long time doing all sorts of work remediating some of these problems. A lot of them are connected to the water system. One thing I guess I'll mention, the technology, of course, through mining in the Coeur d'Alenes changed to get more and more out of the ore. But one of the things that happened as we moved through the 20th century, as they do that, get more and more efficient, the byproduct gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and that seems good, except that makes it spread easier and faster and further. The first stuff is big chunks and things like that. It's a little easier to keep track of. So moving on to one more element of mining, and this is dredging. This is something that was really important in Idaho history, both mining history and water history. Dredges were working the rivers in Idaho as early as 1901. They're grinding their way through gravel in stream beds. They grind away in old tailing piles to recover ore or minerals that they didn't get before the first time around. And it promised millions of dollars to the companies that are running these dredges. That was the hope. As early as the 1930s, the Grange, which is an organization of farmers, opposes dredging because they're seeing an increase in siltation in their rivers and mucking up their irrigation ditches, and that's not something they want. There's also this vision, this contest perhaps between the miners and the farmers. Farmers are saying, this is just a short-term sort of thing. We're here long-term. And we should protect the long-term economic interests of Idaho, not the short-term economic interests. And the farmers are making this again in the 1930s. This sort of argument is being made. By the 1940s, people who are fishing these streams and who like to fish these streams, so let me stop here. There's your first time of me talking about people playing in these waters. I've been talking about work, now play. All of a sudden you can hear me better? That's starting to happen as well. So the folks who are fishing are alarmed at what's happening to their streams where these dredges are. The Yankee Fork became the real exemplar of this. 1949, I have this quotation. They just went through that once beautiful meadow and stream and left it a desolate waste. Something should be done about it. And this is an aerial shot of the Yankee Fork now. This is the remnant or the aftermath of dredging there. The Idaho Statesman says this. Can you read that? Usually they say don't read off PowerPoint slides, but I'm going to have to. Certainly there can be no quibbling with the fact that the monster dredges can, in a very short time, turn what was once a beautiful mountain river of great scenic attraction into a flowing channel of muck, killing off fish which once provided outdoor recreation and leaving in their wake a ghastly pile of rubble. This is the Idaho Statesman. I don't have the year right here in front of me. One of the things I like about this quotation is it puts these two things together, the working and the playing. And the one is impinging on the ability of people to do the other. So this sort of contest, I think we see it here by the 1950s, I think increasingly defines Idaho's relationship to water in lots and lots of circumstances. Another passage, 1954, where people said, this wasn't the Yankee Fork, said one of their finest stretches of trout fishing in the world had been turned into an eyesore that makes the blood of sportsmen run hot every time they think of it. This is a real political hot potato, a real big issue. So, that year, 1954, the Idaho Wildlife Federation comes together and they put on the ballot an initiative. Because the Idaho legislature was not going to say to the Idaho mining community that wants to use dredges, you got to stop doing that. So a citizen initiative comes together, and this initiative does a variety of things. It gives the administrative power over dredging to the land board in the state government rather than the mining commission. It requires settling ponds, which was supposed to improve and stop some of the downstream siltation. It required that dredge companies pay bonds ahead of time rather than clean up afterwards because they weren't recovering that. And there was a minimum size of the dredge that could be regulated, and they shrank that. In short, this initiative gave the state government more power to regulate dredging in Idaho rivers. 1954, the mining industry thought it was designed to put them out of business. The mining industry thought that it was designed to keep Idaho in a primitive state of their economy. Idaho voters in 1954 approved that with a margin of 5-1. Wasn't super close. I'm not sure we could get that good a margin on many things anymore. But, you knew there was a but, right? Enforcement was slow. Here's a passage. Sportsmen feel that they have accomplished a great benefit to the state and to mankind through this dredge initiative. The Department of Lands feels hesitant as to the value of the initiative unless we can get full cooperation from the operators. If you do the best you can under our supervision, we will then be willing to take a lot of abuse from the sportsmen. However, if we have trouble getting you to do the minimum requirements, we do not hesitate to say that the sportsmen may be able to close your operation. So I'm not sure exactly how to read that. On the one hand, it sort of says, just kind of try and go along and you'll be fine. On the other hand, it says, if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to let a bunch of fishers shut you down. At any rate, one study I read said the first enforcement measure from this law happened a mere 26 years later. Okay. Next, now rivers and irrigation. First, some quick preliminaries. The first irrigation that I'm aware of in Idaho occurred near Lapwai with missionaries on the what was predated the reservation, the Nez Perce Reservation. This is part of a larger hope to transform the culture of Native peoples in America. Farming was part of this, getting people to stay in one place, embrace things like private property was all part of this sort of change that was happening at this time. This begins in the 1830s and 1840s. Mormons in southeastern Idaho also bring irrigation into the territory probably by the 1850s and 1860s, but it's slow. Irrigation is slow to develop in Idaho, in part because this is what people see. There's a lot of sagebrush in southern Idaho, and that had to be removed before farms could be built. Not an easy thing to do. Also a lot, you can't see them in this picture, but I'm sure they're there, a lot of jackrabbits in southern Idaho that make it really difficult for farmers to do their job as well. And also, in some parts of southern Idaho, the water is way, way down there. And so it's pretty difficult to get water to the places where farmers wanted to have their fields. So there's a lot of preparation, a lot of difficulties before irrigation could happen. It spread piecemeal fashion. And so, what happens? Well, in good American Western spirit, we turn to the federal government. And in 1894, I should have had a date up there, in 1894, Congress passes something called the Carry Act, which is a real significant act for Idaho. The Carry Act promised desert states in the West that they could have 1 million acres of federal public domain if the states promised to irrigate that land. The people that would construct the canals or the dams, if those were necessary, were guaranteed a profit. They would make money selling the water to new settlers who would come in. Now, throughout the American West, this is an abysmal failure. There are states that don't even get 10,000 acres reclaimed this way. But it works fabulously in Idaho, as fabulously as anything does of this nature. The Twin Falls Southside Project by Ira B. Perrine is the big example of this working. And from strictly a real estate investment perspective, it's fantastic. I want to get my stats correct. If you bought an acre in 1905 on the project for $50, 14 years later you could sell it for $400. That's not bad. I think all of us wouldn't mind selling off property and getting that sort of return in just a few years. Within about 20 years on that particular project, 250,000 acres got irrigated. That's a lot of crops. And about 1,300 new farms were constructed in the Twin Falls area. All told, in the Carry Act, 850,000 acres were reclaimed. And one study claims that it brought $100 million of investment to Idaho and 50,000 new people. It was huge. And it was designed, I should have said this a little bit earlier, it was designed for this. This is the image that we want to create. You can't tell there's a little deer right there. This is a little irrigation ditch and a woman holding her baby. Mary Halleck Foote is the artist who created this image. She was an author, an artist, and married to an irrigation engineer and spent a little bit of time in Boise. This was what we would create with irrigation in the West. A safe place for families, a feminine place where you hang out with deers. Nice, nurturing, wonderful. But as I mentioned, the Carry Act failed everywhere else. Just Wyoming, it kind of was okay. Everywhere else, really, really not good at all. So we turn to the government again, the federal government again. And we passed, this is in 1902. I don't know why I didn't put the dates on this. I apologize for that. In 1902, we passed the National Reclamation Act. It's also called the Newlands Act. It's called Newlands after the sponsor, not because it created new lands. And this is a federal response. Now, before it was a federal response too, right? The Carry Act gave land to the state. Here, the federal government just sort of stayed. They're going to create this new system on their own. They took money from public land sales and funded a reclamation fund. The federal government built dams, built canals, and they created these big giant projects too. The Minidoka project, which is just sort of north of the South Side project that I was just talking about, is one of them. This is a map of it. As you'll notice, everything is at right angles because that's how nature works when seen through the eyes of government agents. And this is the favorite picture I came across in preparing this. This is an all-female surveying crew surveying for the Minidoka project in southern Idaho. The Minidoka project does roughly the same size of reclamation, about 250,000 acres as well as the Southside project. It's cheaper than the land and the water from the Carry Act projects, but it's slower because government works slow, right? It's a slower process. It gets people excited. They move on out there, and what do they find? The water is not there yet. So some folks go broke because the water isn't there. So people get a little enthused, and it didn't work out so well. Always. The Boise project is another example of a Newlands Act reclamation project in Idaho. There are a few others as well. So overall, there are some mixed results of reclaiming the desert of Idaho. By 1920, 13,000 miles of ditches and canals. Just wrap your head around that for just a second. 13,000 miles. That feels like a whole lot to me. 18,000 farms, 2 million acres or so irrigated by 1920 through these investments in various ways with help from the federal government, with help from financiers from Chicago and places like that. It radically changes what southern Idaho looks like. It radically changes the number of people who are living in the state. But it's not so easy. In one project, evaporation lost about a third of all water that was stored. So this was, the statistic I have here is out of 314,000 acre feet, they lost 96,000 acre feet. Not a particularly efficient system. You lose a lot through seepage. Then there are pests. There are muskrats in canals that weaken the walls and have your canal blow out. You've got weeds that are blowing from your neighbor's property onto yours. You have pests that might arrive, perhaps grasshoppers, or those jackrabbits which just won't die. And some projects just failed. They didn't get enough money. People lost money because there wasn't a good enough market. Some of the private projects get taken over by the federal government. So, okay, well, we see the problem, we'll take it over. It doesn't work for them either. Some real challenges, which were not supposed to happen. The rhetoric around creating these projects was that, and we'll talk about this in just a few more minutes, maybe more than a few more minutes, in a little while, was supposed to be really easy. It turned out to be more complicated. Really briefly, I want to talk about hydropower. In the 1950s, there's a big push to create something called Hells Canyon High Dam. That's a rendering of it right there in Hells Canyon. It was going to be, I believe, the tallest dam in America, maybe the world at the time. Not all. Of the three northwestern states, there are politicians from Idaho, from Washington, and Oregon who are really in favor of this. This is going to be massive. It's going to be a public project, which meant the power was going to be cheap. And it was going to help really modernize the Pacific Northwest. But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was 3 smaller dams, and they were private, not public. The fear was that was going to cost more. Power would cost more for us. But it was Idaho, in part, turning its back on federal government, federal intrusion, and saying, no, we want more local control, we want more local business, we want this to be private, not public. This is after the decade before and the 2 decades before, the federal government investing a whole lot of money into Idaho during the Depression and World War II. Idaho was done with that. This is a little bit also the upriver part of the whole Northwest and Columbia River Basin saying to the downstream, we're tired of you calling the shots, we're going to do it differently here. But the idea of damming in Hells Canyon wouldn't die. So we don't get Hells Canyon High Dam. But just a few years after that is defeated, there's another proposal that comes up. And this is a fascinating little history. I hope you'll let me tell it for a second. The federal government says we're going to put a new dam in at a place called High Mountain Sheep. I want you to know that if you're ever creating a presentation and you want to get a picture of High Mountain Sheep and you Google High Mountain Sheep, you don't get a picture of High Mountain Sheep, you get a lot of pictures of sheep, just so you know. But then a consortium of private power companies also petition and say, I think we should have the dam, just like those 3 private dams instead of the big Hells High Canyon Dam. We should have it. And so there's conflict. Now, whether it's a public power facility or a private power facility, the Federal Power Commission is the one that gets to say whether a dam gets to be built. And you have 2 proposals for the same place, you have conflict, and it ends up in court. In 1967, this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And there, sitting on that court, is a man who I spent a great deal of time with in my head, named William O. Douglas, who's from Yakima, Washington, and knows this country in the Northwest pretty well. And he's on the court trying to decide this decision. And the decision was this going to be a public dam or a private dam? And Justice Douglas said, we probably should be asking really whether there should even be a dam. This was not a question that had occurred to anyone to ask at this point. And he persuaded 5 other people on the court that he was right. And he said, among other things, the ecology of a river is different from the ecology of a reservoir built behind a dam. It's the first time the word ecology was used in a Supreme Court decision. And it ended it. There's no dam at High Mountain Sheep. It was a convoluted ending because it got technically remanded back to the Federal Power Commission, but people were just done with the issue. Another thing he said about this, the need to destroy a river as a waterway, the desirability of its demise, the choices available to satisfy future demands for energy, these are all relevant. He's asking people to think about things that they hadn't thought about before. The decision empowers the courts to have greater judicial review about decisions in administrative agencies like this. It's really important. Okay. Recreation. Here's the play part. More of the play part. Shoshone Falls, you can see here, these are two images by two really important American artists. Photographer Timothy O'Sullivan is the one who took the shot on the upper right, and Thomas Moran is the lower left. These are great, important, significant people in American history. Now, early on, people see this and think, this is magnificent. This needs to be protected. In fact, Idahoans, the turn of the 20th century, said, we think this should be a national park. And others said, well, we should have just a grand hotel and a fabulous resort there. The General Land Office, which is the entity that oversaw things like the Homestead Act, they told people, we've reserved it so you can't take it. So it can't be sold. Then an Idaho governor said, this is going to interfere with irrigation plans that we have. So we didn't get a magnificent resort, and we didn't get a magnificent national park there. And of course, if you've ever been there, you're lucky to see water, because often there's no water flowing over Shoshone Falls. It was not to be. Next stage of recreation, in 1935, I believe it was, National Geographic sponsored the Salmon River Expedition. Fantastic event. Lots of publicity because it's National Geographic. You should check out the story. There are wonderful, wonderful pictures of the Salmon River trip. They invited along scientists, because it's National Geographic. They're trying to figure out some sort of geological information to do with the Salmon River Canyon as they floated around. But they also invited a local politician, a guy named Deworth Clark, I believe his name was. He went along. It's a big ordeal. The stories are great. They get stuck, of course, on rocks, so they have to unload everything from that thing in order to get it over and continue on down the river. It connects not only to the science that they're trying to do, but it connects with the past, because you hear the stories there. They keep coming across these little mining camps that are remnants way back where in the middle of these Idaho mountains along this river. This is really great. But ultimately, it's about adventure, right? It's about fun. It's about men, of course, going and conquering these places that hadn't been conquered before. And then writing stories and telling about it and getting other people to want to come to Idaho and do this. It really booms after World War II. They use surplus Army or Navy equipment probably to get the rafts going, and we then start to develop that sort of rafting culture that happens that probably many of you have participated in Idaho at this a little bit later. Moving into that period, I want to talk about a couple of dams. In 1948, there was a big flood in the Pacific Northwest. It wiped out the second largest town in Oregon, a place called Vanport, which was between Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. And because of that, lots of people upstream, like, we need to build more dams to prevent that from happening again. And in the Clearwater Basin, the two proposals were Bruce's Eddy and Penny Cliffs dams. And folks in Idaho, the guy named A.B. Curtis, who was a mayor at one point in Orofino, was really behind this Bruce's Eddy Dam especially. And they started working hard to try to get these dams built to regulate the flow a little bit. Besides regulating flow, they're going to generate power. And then they tried for a while to say it was going to help float logs downstream to Potlatch and Lewiston too, but that didn't really seem to work so well. the thing that was really interesting about this, if you think about Idaho in the mid-20th century, you might not expect this. There's immediate outcry from hunters and fishers. So you're going to ruin winter elk habitat if you put the dam there and you have a big reservoir behind it. You can't do that, and you're going to kill out all the anadromous fish that are left. And there aren't many left. There was a dam put in near Lewiston in 1927. It's not there anymore. It killed off a lot of the salmon and steelhead swimming upstream. There was a man named Mort Brigham who worked for Potlatch who sort of led the charge against this. He said, "There's utterly no reason for the Clearwater dams except to pacify the Army engineers' love of authority and special interests interested in handling logs." Potlatch fired him. He lost his job in his work for this. Ultimately, what happened is we got Dworshak Dam, which was the Bruce's Eddy one, but the Penny Cliffs goes away. That's the site of Dworshak, that picture there. One of the people that was in favor of Dworshak Dam was a person who ran for the Senate and achieved that position by the name of Frank Church. That's him there on the right a little bit later. This is in the late 1950s. He was in favor of this. He said, we got to develop Idaho. We need water power to develop Idaho. And that's what's going to happen as part of his campaign. So it's odd to some that 10 years later, he leads the charge to create something called the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which passes in 1968. He's one of the leading voices for that. And the way he evolves towards that is he says, we need some dams. He's in favor of what becomes Dworshak Dam, right? But some places he doesn't want dams. He wanted to make sure that the Salmon River, for example, continued to run free. So he sponsored in Congress a bill that would have made that happen. And he failed. And that concerned him. And so he took a shift. Like that would have helped Idaho, right? To preserve the Salmon River, no dams, would have been good for Idaho. But he recognized maybe Idaho and the nation share some things in common. So he broadens his vision and he gets as part of this the broader Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which passes in 1968. I think the original act protects, I want to say it's 8 rivers, and 2 of them are in Idaho. And then there's something like 22 study rivers, which, as I read the legislation, sort of says, we think these should probably be wild and scenic, but you probably should check it out a little more detailed first. And a number of those were also in Idaho. It's because of Frank Church in a large part that happens. This is a shot I took in September of the Middle Fork of the Salmon, which was on the very first, was protected with that Wild and Scenic River Act. Okay. So that's I'm not done. Sorry, I just sounded like I was going to say I was done. That's like the lecture portion of the talk. But one of the things that intrigued me as I was preparing for this, and I realize I'm going on for a long time, I apologize for that, is I found some really interesting sources from the past. This is what historians do, right? And I want to talk about a few of them. I think there are 4 or so that I want to talk about because it makes that past come alive in really interesting ways. So I want to share, because I was excited, I want to share my excitement a little bit with you. So the first one I looked at was this article from 1898 in the Overland Monthly, which on its masthead somewhere says, devoted to the development of the country. And it has this article called The Snake River Country, a wild part of Idaho. And it's just great. And it talks about the never-ending supply of water. You can send down the river through the Great Plains of Idaho on its way to the Pacific Ocean. In this 1898 article, Shoshone Falls is referred to as a world wonder. It rivals Niagara in its beauty and variety and weirdness. Already in 1898, they're looking to get people here for tourism, for play, and that connection to water. But also work. It only needs irrigation and cultivation to make it a veritable garden spot, and such it will come in time. Really easy, wonderful, great stuff happening. Okay. You're not going to be able to see this at all, and maybe I'm not either. I'm going to have to get close. So this is the cartoon version of Idaho history. It's called The Story of an Irrigated Farm. And I'll read what the panels say as best I can make them out from here. So Congress votes the money. The plans are drawn up. The engineers arrive on the job. The land is staked out. Construction begun. The dam completed. Applying for farms. The settlers arrive. Homes are built. Water is turned on. Cultivation begun. Crops flowered. Something to the market. The returns. And then the results of labor. Super smooth. Super smooth process. What is that? 3 by 5, 15 stages. You go from desolate nothingness to the results, the profitable results of your labor. There are no jackrabbits. I've looked real close with magnifying glasses. There are no grasshoppers. There are no bankruptcies up there. And I assure you there were bankruptcies in Idaho when we were trying to accomplish this sort of thing. There's a single person laboring. Not many farms had a single person. You had your whole family out there, plus your neighbors, plus eventually a migratory workforce working there too. But this is, I think I mentioned earlier, so it's sold as pretty easy. This looks pretty easy. That's not the results of it though. But if you're, a middling sort in middle America and you want something new, heck, that sounds all right. I think I can handle that.
Where was that from?
I don't know.
Was it like a booster piece?
Yeah, but I'm not sure who produced it or where it appeared. I have it from a secondary source. Yeah, a reputable one. So this was probably my very favorite thing that I found. This was an article in the Saturday Evening Post, 1949, Troubleshooters of the River. It's written by a man named William Warden, who I'd never heard of before. And Saturday Evening Post sent a reporter and a photographer to North Idaho. And they were headed to Priest River, and they were going to chronicle the log drive from the lake, Priest Lake, to the town of Priest River where the mill was. And it's just a fantastic story. You should all read it. The author opens it up with this wonderful portrait with a description of this big burly man who every Saturday evening has to settle matters, and sometimes a few chairs and tables get broken. I just love that. And then when they're chronicling the drive, someone loses their oar, and they said that person resulted to machine gun profanity. I'm not sure exactly what that was, but I can imagine. And it just goes on and talking about what happens here and these great color pictures associated with it. And these river drivers are amazing people, right? It's super dangerous work. They've got log jams that hold up to 1 million board feet. That's a lot of wood. It's super dangerous. You get a jam, it can it can double the size of the river. These things can move. I'm throwing things apart here. The current can be going 30 miles an hour going down the river on these things. This is super dangerous, amazing work. But the people that are working there know the water, right? They know how the river moves. That's why they're doing their job, how they're able to do their job. They know where it is likely to get caught up. They can anticipate that sometimes. Sometimes they can't. Sometimes they got to throw a little dynamite in to loosen up the jam to get it going. Not really great on riverine ecology, I don't think. And it was confusing to the author. Like, why would these people do this? The pay's not that great. It's super dangerous. But this is what it says. What attracts these men is difficult to decide. They compete for the privilege of working in wet boots for more than a month, being wet over much of that time. The work is hard, temporary, and dangerous. Still, it was work on the river, and better than any other way to make a living. And then they arrive at the town, and there's a big festival, and there's a big party. And who's at the party? But log rollers. They would never do this work, though. These are professional competitors. These are people doing it for play, not for work. The guys with the machine gun profanity, they weren't the ones at the contest at the end of the day. Last, and I have to do this, but I shouldn't do this because I'm not qualified. I apologize ahead of this. I'm going to probably apologize 3 more times in the next 2 minutes. I need to talk about Idaho Native people and waters as well, because it encourages us to recognize other ways of knowing and interacting with the world than any of the ones that I've just shared. So I want to briefly, sort of, kind of, not very well, tell a little bit of a story that's from the oral traditions derived from the Coeur d'Alene. And first you need some background. Native peoples have been here since time immemorial. And across this territory, the world was being prepared for these, for us, for Native people and First People by coyote, by jackrabbit, by hawk, by others. Coyote's one of the more famous ones, though, of course. He's often playing tricks. He's known as a trickster, right? And he's helping prepare the world for humans. And Coyote helped create Lake Coeur d'Alene. This is a picture of Lake Coeur d'Alene. And here's sort of how it goes. There was this rock monster who was bugging everybody just north of here, probably 50 miles north of here, bothering the first people. Rock monsters bothering the first people. And so the first people went and asked Coyote for some help. He said, Coyote, please, can you help? And Coyote said, okay, if you feed me, keep me fed with mice and snakes, I will help you. Okay. So Coyote taunts and teases Rock Monster all around, moving around. And as that's happening, Rock Monster is creating all these landscapes, buttes that we know, canyons we know, streams that we know. But Rock Monster is dogged, and Coyote gets tired. Coyote is tired of being chased, so here's what I'll do. And Coyote runs through the huckleberry patch. And there's a cliff. And Coyote knows there's a cliff. And he runs through the huckleberry patch, and he jumps off, and he hangs on. Rock Monster doesn't know. Follows him, goes through the huckleberry patch, covered in huckleberry juice, and over the cliff, and makes Lake Coeur d'Alene blue. And the way I understand this, through a colleague and friend who many of you probably know, Rodney Fry, when the story is told every time, that again makes Lake Coeur d'Alene blue. And I think similarly, when we tell stories about Idaho's water, when we understand our history, we root ourselves in place. We understand the power of story and the power of history to make the world that we live in today. And that's it. Thank you. I'm happy to talk more or not, either way. Questions, comments, criticisms, if they're gentle.
You didn't touch on the tribal claims to Idaho water.
You're right. I'm not a lawyer. Idaho Native people have first claims on water because of something called the Winters Doctrine, which goes back more than 100 years. And this continues to be a contentious legal battle ongoing in lots of different places. But I didn't prepare to talk about that, so I'm going to end it right there with all I had to say, unless you wanted to add something to that. No.
So I grew up in southern Idaho and was never enamored with the jackrabbits nor the sagebrush. And every time we go back to visit or we go through, I think to myself, what on earth are people thinking? So you gave a really great, history about the irrigation, and it's interesting, but were there people also saying, why are you irrigating the sagebrush? I mean, it just seems ludicrous to me.
Well, that's a good comment. And I think it depends on when and where you are. The first white folks that moved through Idaho hit here and go, oh my goodness, can we get through here faster? I mean, it's really, if you read Oregon Trail diaries, there's not a lot of good that's said about this part of the world. But a few decades later, there's a recognition that, well, stuff's going to grow if we can just get water to it. And this is the rise of the figure of the engineer who's supremely confident. I guess I didn't talk about, there's this fellow by the name of E.B. Darlington who ended up directing the Minidoka project. He also worked on the North Side project in Twin Falls. And he said, engineers are the understudies of the creator. I mean, we're going to remake the world here with my degree from, the State University. And so there was a real confidence and a belief that we could transform it. There's some that are going to even go back to the Bible, which says we need to make the desert bloom as a rose. So there's a lot of confidence to do it. And the sagebrush and the jackrabbits are just a temporary impediment.
What impact did the Grand Teton Dam have in terms of the change of thinking and terms of development of, or not development of future dams?
This is the failure in the early 70s, I think is when it was. That's a good question. And I'm not sure I have a good answer. I think it's part of a general moment in American history, not just Idaho history, but American history of questioning lots of dam building. 1977, President Jimmy Carter lists a whole bunch of water projects that are on the books, says we got to get rid of these, we shouldn't do this anymore. Environmentalists have increasing legal power and political power to stop these sort of water projects. So I'm not sure I could pinpoint that dam failure, which sent people scurrying out of the way of the waters and caused lots of property damage, if that reversed anything, it is part of a movement and a moment where there's lots of reconsideration going on about the wisdom of all of this sort of thing. That's how I would answer your question. One of my zoom out answers. Yeah.
Any thoughts about the lower Snake River dams? And the controversy?
I think I'm being recorded. Not as a historian. I don't have any. I don't think I have any comments as a historian. And I look forward to seeing what happens. When this gets turned off, maybe afterwards I'll tell you what I really think. Yeah.
So where is Shoshone Falls, and why is there not that much water there anymore?
It's just upstream from Twin Falls, Idaho, and lots of water gets diverted into sugar beet fields, and that's why water's not going over it anymore. Yeah, sorry about that. Didn't orient us. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I love the history. I learned so much this evening, although I couldn't help but feel disheartened through most of it that, this sort of big money and corporate greed wins every time. And history proves that, and it's continued today. It's like, how do we fight against that? How do we move forward in a positive way when we look back? And, even the studies show at the time, yeah, there's demolition, there's destruction, there's death, yet we're going to continue doing it because the money's there. And that's, what we've continued to do. So at what point do things change?
I don't know.
The story and everything just.
Well, I think, gosh, you guys are asking delicate questions. I would say that there was another way to view, especially, I'm not sure there's another way to view what happens in northern Idaho with the mining pollution, but in southern Idaho, those 18,000 farms I mentioned, most of those aren't corporate farms, at least not in 1920. And so from that perspective, it was not supporting corporate greed, but it was actually getting families places to live and work and hopefully have some little prosperity. Now things maybe change at later points in time. I think knowing history helps us make decisions. That's the premise of my life. So I have to. That's why I'm here and talking about these things, so that maybe you learn something new and think about your own decisions moving forward. Something like that. Maybe. Yeah.
Do you work with the local tribes collaboratively in your research, or do you have any role
I don't.
with their decisions or anything?
I don't. That's not where. I haven't, I guess I should say. That's not where I have done my work so far in my career. Aaron.
So I really appreciated, of course, that you named some of your favorite primary sources that you used. Is there anything that you've looked at archivally that really surprised you in a way that I'm sure that's a pretty open question, but something you really didn't expect to see for some of this research?
I think I knew this before, but I was reminded how early the sort of tourism impulse was there. I mean, when you've got articles in the Overland Monthly in 1898 talking about it already, that you start thinking, there's very few people even live in here at that point, and they're already trying to get people to come and tour it. That was maybe a surprise to me. What was interesting to me reading the sources was just how well they illustrate things that historians have been saying. So that's a good thing. That's what historians are supposed to come up with their interpretations based on the sources they read, and it turns out they do. I can confirm that they do. So, yeah. And I guess the other thing, sorry, this is going on and on, I'm impressed with the vigor of the opposition to Bruce's Eddy Dam by hunters and fishers in the 1940s and 50s. And not pleased that Potlatch fired a guy for speaking out. Yeah.
You mentioned 1898. I don't remember what year Idaho became a state from a territory. It was
1890.
Close, right there.
Yeah.
So it was before it was a state even. They were
just after. The article came just after.
1898, 1889, yeah.
Yeah. Very close. Did you have a question?
I was just going to point out, you said you were impressed by the vigor that hunters and anglers were kind of fighting that, and we're starting to see that again in this issue of public lands, that conservationists are joining forces with sportsmen, and a lot of times they've been kind of in opposition, but they're both saying, hey, we want access to our public lands and we don't want to see those sold off. So it's kind of interesting to see that coming back around.
Yep. There are moments where those groups work really closely together and then they forget the sort of natural alliance and then they go, oh yeah, there's this alliance. Oh, we forget. And yeah, I think we are witnessing that moment right now again as the threats to access heighten. Well, I've been droning for an hour, so I appreciate your patience. Thank you so much for being here.